He thought it was just a $10 cab ride home, but the driver's story ripped open the shadows of his empire and cost him more than sleep. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets into black mirrors that reflected the glow of neon signs and traffic lights. Adrian Vale stepped out of the lobby of his office tower, his umbrella still folded at his side. Usually he would have called for his driver, the sleek black sedan, always waiting to carry him anywhere he wished. But tonight, he wanted something else. He did not even know why. He lifted his hand as a yellow cab splashed to the curb, only that he was tired of the polished surfaces and careful routines that filled his life. The door handle was wet when he pulled it open, and the smell inside the car was a mix of damp seats and faint coffee. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a quick flick of the eyes that carried no recognition. Adrian found it oddly comforting. In most rooms he entered, people knew his name before he spoke, their expressions shifting the moment they realized they were in the presence of wealth and power. Here, in the back seat of a rain-streaked cab, he was just another man looking for a ride home. He told the driver his address, a penthouse across the city, and the driver nodded once before pulling into the slow flow of traffic. The meter clicked, its red digits glowing faintly, starting at $3 and climbing toward 10 as they turned onto the main avenue. The city outside blurred through the wet glass, people hurrying under umbrellas, steam rising from subway grates, horns cutting through the steady drumming of rain. Adrian loosened his tie and leaned back against the seat. The leather cracked in places, the springs groaning as the car shifted lanes. He felt the rhythm of the ride in his chest, the hum of the engine, mixing with the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. For once, there was no assistant tapping on a tablet beside him, no driver glancing at him through a mirror with careful respect. It was quiet, ordinary, almost peaceful. The driver said nothing at first, his focus fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Adrian studied those hands, broad and strong, marked by work that did not belong to the city. They were hands that had lifted, carried, built, not soft, not idle. He wondered what story lived behind them, though he did not ask. He was not used to asking. He was used to being told what he needed to know. Never more, never less. Minutes passed in silence, until the cab slowed for a light. Adrian looked at the meter again, the red numbers climbing toward 10. It struck him as strange that this short ride, so simple, so cheap, felt heavier than many of the decisions that filled his days. He pressed his palm against the fogged window, feeling the coolness of the glass. The rain kept falling, steady and unbroken, and for the first time in a long while, he let the city move around him without trying to control it. The ride cost him $10, nothing more, but something in the quiet hum of that cab told him the night was not finished with him yet. The rain eased into a mist as the cab rolled through the city, but the windshield wipers kept moving back and forth, steady as a heartbeat. Adrian sat back, the hum of the engine filling the space, when he felt the driver's eyes on him through the rearview mirror. It was not the quick glance of someone checking traffic, or the casual look of a man seeing who he carried. It was different, slower, as if the driver were studying him, as if he had already decided there was more to this passenger than a damp suit and a tired expression. Adrian met the gaze for a second before turning his own eyes to the window, yet he still felt the weight of it. The driver looked older than Adrian had first noticed, lines cut deep across his forehead, not from age alone but from years of worry and work. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his shoulders slightly hunched but not weak. His eyes, caught in the mirror when the lights of passing cars flickered, held a strange mix of exhaustion and alertness, like a man who had seen too much to relax completely. There was no recognition in them, no sign that he knew Adrian's face from the magazines or the television interviews. It was not fame that held his attention. It was something else, something Adrian could not yet name. Adrian's own gaze dropped to the driver's hands, They gripped the wheel firmly, the knuckles showing white at every turn, the skin rough and scarred in places. These were not the hands of a man who had spent his life behind a desk, nor the polished hands of the chauffeurs who usually drove him. These were working hands, shaped by lifting crates, hauling equipment, maybe even the kind of labor that left a man with aches he never admitted. Adrian, who had built his empire on logistics and supply chains, recognized the silent story written in those hands. He knew the type of men who loaded the trucks, who kept the warehouses moving, who were invisible to the boardrooms but vital to the bottom line. The thought made him uncomfortable. He shifted slightly in his seat, as though the cracked leather could give him an answer. He wondered why this driver was watching him so closely, what he saw reflected in the mirror. Was it wealth, or loneliness, or just another late-night fare trying to get home? Adrian tried to dismiss it, telling himself he was imagining things. But the driver's gaze lingered, steady and patient, and it made the ride feel heavier. Outside, the city blurred with streaks of red brake lights and pale street lamps, but inside the cab there was only the quiet, the breathing of two men, one rich and restless, the other weary but sharp. Adrian found himself wishing for the silence to break, for the driver to say something, anything, to explain the look in his eyes. Instead, the car kept rolling forward, the meter climbing, the air filled with unsaid things that pressed harder than words. The ride was only $10, but Adrian already felt the cost reaching deeper, carried in the watchful eyes of a stranger who seemed to see more than he should. The cab rolled through the wet streets, tires hissing over the slick pavement, and for a while, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the wipers and the soft hum of the engine. Then the driver spoke, his voice low and even, asking the kind of questions that filled empty space. He mentioned the weather, how the rain had been falling for days, how it slowed traffic and made people impatient. Adrian answered politely, his words clipped, the way he always did with strangers who tried to pull him into conversation. He said something about the forecast, about how the city always seemed to choke when it rained too long. It should have been nothing more than small talk, the kind of exchange that disappeared the moment the car stopped, but there was something in the driver's tone that refused to vanish. Every word the man spoke carried a weight that did not match the casual subject. His pauses stretched too long. His eyes in the rearview mirror seemed to measure Adrian, to test if he was really listening. He mentioned traffic on the bridge, how an accident had backed up cars for hours earlier that week, and when he spoke of the wreck his voice tightened, almost as if he were not talking about strangers on a highway, but something closer, something remembered. Adrian gave another polite response, yet he felt himself leaning forward slightly, caught by the undercurrent beneath the words. The driver asked if Adrian worked late often, gesturing toward the suit and the briefcase at his side. Adrian nodded, said it came with the territory, long nights and longer mornings. He expected the driver to let it go, but instead the man gave a small laugh, one that held no amusement. He said he used to work nights too, back when his life was different. The way he said it, with a quiet finality, made Adrian wonder what had changed, what had been taken from him. Adrian tried to push the conversation back into safer ground, asking how long the man had been driving cabs, but the answer came with a sigh. Too long, the driver said, but it paid enough to keep food on the table. The words were simple, yet the silence that followed was not. It was the silence of someone who had been forced into work he did not choose, someone carrying a story that pressed against his ribs every time he drew breath. The city slid past outside the windows, neon spilling across wet glass, but inside the cab it felt smaller, the space between them filling with something unsaid. Adrian felt it settling over him, heavier than the rain, heavier than the traffic. He realized he was no longer answering out of habit. He was listening. The driver's voice, steady and weary, held the shape of a story waiting to be told, and Adrian, for reasons he did not yet understand, wanted to hear it. The meter climbed toward $10, but the ride was no longer ordinary. It was carrying him somewhere he had not planned to go. The light turned green, and the cab rolled forward. the city opening in front of them in a blur of wet glass and glowing signs. Adrian watched the driver's shoulders move with the wheel. Steady, deliberate, the kind of motion that came from long hours and muscle memory. The conversation had slipped back into silence after their talk of traffic and long nights, and Adrian thought perhaps that was the end of it. Just another cab ride with a stranger who carried more weight than he cared to share. But then the driver spoke again, his voice quiet, as if meant only for himself. "My daughter Lila used to tell me the rain was good luck," he said, and the name hung in the air like a bell that had been struck too hard. He did not add anything after. No explanation, no small laugh to soften it. Only that single name, Lila, as if it carried the whole story in one breath. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, the tendon showing white against the rough skin, and then he fell silent. Adrian felt it at once, the shift in the air, the way the cab seemed to grow heavier though nothing had changed. He leaned back against the cracked leather seat, but his eyes stayed fixed on the mirror, on the driver who now looked fixedly at the road as though silence could erase the word he had just spoken. Adrian had sat in countless boardrooms, where men revealed more than they meant to in a single phrase, a stray detail that opened the truth wider than hours of careful speech. He knew what it felt like when someone had let too much slip. Lila. The sound of it carried warmth and sorrow both. Adrian wanted to ask, wanted to fill the space that stretched too wide between them, but he knew enough not to press too quickly. The driver's silence was not the silence of indifference, it was the silence of regret, of someone who feared the story would unravel him if he gave it voice. They turned down another street, puddles flashing beneath headlights, and Adrian studied the city outside but felt none of it. He kept hearing the name echo in his mind, Lila. It was not uncommon for drivers to talk about their families, to mention wives or children, as they filled time with strangers. Yet, this was different. It had not been offered lightly, and it had not been followed with pride or comfort. It had been a slip, a word that carried more than the driver had intended to show. Adrian shifted, restless, the briefcase at his side forgotten. He had built a life measured in numbers and schedules, where every detail could be managed if he looked at it long enough. But this was not something he could manage, not something he could balance in a column. It was simply there, a truth half buried in the space of a $10 ride. The driver's eyes flicked once more to the mirror, catching Adrian's gaze before darting back to the road, and Adrian knew then that the story was not gone. It waited, heavy and unfinished, and he would not leave this cab without hearing more. The rain thinned into mist as the cab slid through the slow current of traffic, the city lights bleeding across the wet pavement. Adrian had settled back into the seat, trying to untangle the weight of the name the driver had let slip, when the man's voice came again, low and steady, carrying none of the casual rhythm of small talk. "Do you believe people should be punished for telling the truth?" The words hung in the cab like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to wave away. Adrian straightened slightly, his hand tightening on the briefcase at his side, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Questions from strangers rarely surprised him. He was used to people wanting his opinion on money, on business, on the future of markets. But this was different, stripped bare of context, heavy with something personal. He searched the driver's eyes in the mirror and saw no trace of humor, no sign that it was a game. The question was sharp, serious, and it demanded an answer. Adrian cleared his throat, stalling for time, hearing the rumble of the engine fill the pause. "No," he said finally, though his voice lacked the firmness he was used to carrying. "No one should be punished for telling the truth. Lies deserve consequences, not honesty." The driver gave a small nod, but it was not the kind of nod that closed a conversation. It was the kind that opened a door wider. His hand stayed fixed on the wheel, his posture unchanged, yet Adrian could sense the shift again, that same heaviness that had entered the cab when the name Lila had been spoken. "Then why is it," the driver said slowly, "that every time I spoke the truth, I lost something. He didn't look back, didn't raise his voice, but the words were thick with years of weight. I told the truth about what happened at the warehouse. I told the truth about safety reports that disappeared. I told the truth when 2 men didn't make it home because someone thought cutting corners was cheaper than fixing equipment. And for every truth, I was punished. My job, my name, my daughter's peace of mind. All of it stripped because I couldn't keep quiet. Adrian's pulse quickened. He did not need details to understand. The logistics world was full of warehouses, trucks, machinery, corners cut for profit. His own empire depended on them, though he had always believed his systems were clean, efficient, safe. The driver's words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He was not used to being caught unprepared. He was used to controlling the terms of every conversation. Yet here, in the back of a rain-slicked cab, he felt stripped of control. The driver exhaled, the sound heavy, final. Tell me, sir, do you still believe no one is punished for telling the truth? The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Adrian realized this $10 ride was costing him more than money. It was costing him certainty, and perhaps even sleep. The cab moved steadily through the rain, washed streets, headlights glinting off puddles as if the city were scattered with fragments of broken glass. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the man behind the wheel. The driver had asked his heavy question, and now the silence that followed pressed in on both of them. At last, with a quiet sigh, the man began to speak again, not with the light rhythm of small talk, but with the slow precision of someone who had carried a story for too long. He said he had once been a foreman, not just a driver shuttling strangers across the city at night. He spoke of a shipping warehouse, one of the many that fed into the great machine of logistics and trade, a place that connected to companies bigger than he had ever imagined. His job had been to oversee crews, to keep schedules tight, to make sure shipments moved out on time. For years he had done the work well, proud of his position, proud of the men who worked under him. But one night he saw things he wasn't supposed to. Adrian's hands tightened around the strap of his briefcase as he listened. The man described machinery that should have been repaired months earlier, forklifts running with faulty brakes, cranes with frayed cables that groaned under weight. He described reports he had filed, pages filled with warnings that were ignored. He told how managers above him signed off on inspections they never did, how paperwork painted a picture of safety while the floor told another story entirely. Adrian felt a cold unease settle in his chest. He knew warehouses. He knew the pressure to keep them running no matter the risk. But hearing it spoken aloud from someone who had lived it made the cost more real than any report or statistic. The driver's voice grew quieter as he spoke of the day when the warnings proved true. A load too heavy, a cable too thin, a sudden snap like a gunshot, and then the crushing sound of steel meeting flesh. 2 men lost in seconds. Lives ended not by accident, but by neglect. He had written another report, this one filled with blood and grief, and submitted it with the belief that surely, now someone would listen. But instead of action he was called into an office, asked to stay quiet, reminded of the importance of schedules, reminded that jobs depended on shipments going out on time. When he refused to change his story, when he insisted on telling the truth, he was dismissed, his record smeared with lies of incompetence and misconduct. The driver's eyes caught Adrian's in the rearview mirror, dark and steady, and for a moment, Adrian thought he could see the whole of that warehouse reflected there. The weight of machines and the silence of men who had looked the other way, piece by piece, the past had been laid bare. And Adrian felt the sharp sting of recognition. The warehouse was tied to his company, part of the great chain he had built. What the man described was not distant, it was his. The cab continued forward, the meter climbing toward $10, but the ride had already become far more costly. Adrian knew the truth had finally found him, and it would not let him rest easy again. The cab's tires whispered against the wet road, carrying them deeper into the city, while Adrian leaned forward, caught by the rhythm of the driver's story. The man spoke in a steady tone, not dramatic, not searching for pity, but with the plainness of someone who had lived through something that refused to leave him. He described the night of the accident again, the cable snapping, the heavy load crashing down, the screams that echoed through the warehouse, and then the silence that followed, a silence heavier than the steel itself. 2 men gone, and the others left staring at the ground, too afraid to meet one another's eyes. He said he had gone home that night with the weight of it pressing on his chest. His daughter, still young then, had asked why he looked so tired, and he had only shaken his head, promising her he would fix it. He believed in the system, believed that if he filed the proper report, if he documented the truth, then change would follow. So he sat at his small kitchen table, hands still trembling, and filled page after page with every detail he could recall. He listed the faulty equipment, the ignored inspection logs, the supervisors who had waved away his warnings. He made copies, 3 of them, because he wanted to be certain nothing could erase what had happened. When he turned the report in, he expected an investigation, expected to see inspectors walking the floor, expected repairs, expected justice. Instead, he was called into an office 2 days later and told the report had never arrived. The file was gone, vanished, as though it had never been written. He pulled another copy from his bag, placed it on the desk, and watched the manager's expression harden. He was told quietly, firmly, that accidents happened, that drawing attention to them would only hurt the men who still had jobs, that schedules and contracts were more important than stories no one wanted to hear. When he refused to withdraw his claim, the punishment came swift. He was dismissed from his position, escorted from the building like a thief. Rumors spread faster than fire, whispers that he had been drinking on the job, that his negligence had caused the accident, that he had invented his report to cover his mistakes. Within weeks, he was blacklisted. Every warehouse he applied to turned him away. Every interview ended once his name was mentioned. A man once respected as a foreman, trusted with crews and deadlines, was now branded a liar. Adrian listened, his throat tight, his mind racing. He had read about blacklists, about the quiet ways men were erased from industries, but he had never thought about what it meant for a single family, for a single man whose only mistake had been telling the truth. The driver's voice stayed calm, but there was something raw in the pauses, something that made Adrian's chest ache. The cab rolled on, the meter glowing with small numbers, but the true cost of that vanished report stretched far beyond dollars. Adrian knew the man beside him had carried that cost for years, and now, piece by piece, he was laying it down in the dark. The cab's heater rattled softly, filling the silence between words as the driver's story unfolded. Adrian kept his eyes on the mirror, on the man's lined face, on the weight in his voice. He had already heard about the vanished report, about the lies that replaced it, about the blacklist that shut every door in his face. Now the driver's tone shifted, quieter, as if the memory that followed belonged more to the heart than to the world. He spoke of Lila. She had been only 9 when it happened, old enough to understand that something terrible had taken her father's peace, young enough to believe that truth should always win. He said she watched him come home night after night, with shoulders bent and eyes that refused to meet hers. She saw him sit at the kitchen table in silence, staring at the report he kept folded in his pocket, the one that never seemed to matter, no matter how many times he tried to show it. One evening she touched his hand and told him he couldn't stop fighting, not if what he had written was real. He told Adrian how he had tried to smile for her, to explain that sometimes the world wasn't fair, that sometimes telling the truth only brought pain. But she had shaken her head and said the words he could never forget. The truth doesn't stop being true just because people don't want to hear it. A week later, without him knowing, she borrowed his old phone, the one with the cracked case and fading screen. She sat at the small kitchen table where he had written his report and pressed record. In the recording, her voice was soft but steady, the voice of a child who believed more firmly than any adult could. "My dad tells the truth," she said. "He told the truth about the machines, and no one listened, and now people are saying bad things about him. But I know he's right. I know because he always tells me the truth, even when it's hard." The driver said he found the recording days later when she shyly handed him the phone. She told him she wanted the world to hear it, wanted people to understand he wasn't lying, that he was only trying to protect the men he worked with. He had listened to it alone at night, tears filling his eyes, because the faith in her voice was something he no longer carried in himself. She believed when he could not. She spoke when he had grown too tired. Adrian sat back in the cab, the sound of those words echoing in his mind, even though he had never heard the recording himself. He imagined the small voice, steady, unshaken, declaring a truth the world refused to accept. It struck him harder than any statistic or report, because it came not from authority or evidence, but from love. The driver's eyes stayed on the road, but his jaw was tight as he spoke. He said that recording was the only proof he kept now, the only reminder that once, at least, someone believed him. Adrian felt something shift in his chest. He realized the cab ride was no longer about getting home. It was about hearing a truth that demanded to be remembered. The cab turned onto a quieter street, where the storefronts were shuttered, and the rain pooled in deep puddles along the curbs. The driver's voice lowered as though he were speaking to himself rather than to the man in the back seat. He said there came a night when the fight inside him simply broke. For months he had carried copies of the report, knocking on doors, sending letters, waiting for someone in power to listen. Each time he was turned away, each time the door closed a little harder, until the world made it clear he was not a foreman anymore, only a man with no work and no name that anyone trusted. He spoke of Lila again, of her thin face in the dim kitchen light, of the way she pushed food around her plate so he would not notice how little she ate. He said the cupboards were nearly empty that night, the rent late again, the stack of unpaid bills curling at the edges from sitting too long on the table. He looked at her and knew he could not ask her to keep believing in a truth that had cost them everything. She had already given him her faith, her small recording, her quiet insistence that justice mattered. But faith could not buy groceries. Faith could not keep the lights on. So he took the old phone she had used, the one that held her steady voice saying, "My dad tells the truth," and he walked to a pawn shop 2 blocks away. He said the man behind the counter gave him $40, not even enough to cover a week of food, but it was cash in his hand, and it kept them from going hungry that night. He did not tell Lila what he had done, only told her the phone had stopped working, that it was gone. He saw the disappointment in her eyes, but also the quiet understanding. She did not ask questions. Children from hard times learn when not to ask. After that, he stopped knocking on doors. He stopped carrying the report. He put his name on a list of taxi drivers and began working nights, picking up strangers, listening to their small complaints about traffic and weather, saying little about himself. He said it was easier that way, to become invisible, to let the city swallow him whole. Every time he turned the key in the cab, he told himself he was only surviving now, no longer fighting. Adrian gripped the leather seat beside him, his fingers digging into the cracked surface. He felt the weight of the man's surrender pressing into him as though it belonged to him as well. He thought of the phone, of the girl's small voice lost to a pawn shop counter, and the image burned into his mind so sharply he knew he would not sleep tonight. The driver's words had already worked their way into the quiet places of his mind, the places where guilt and memory lived. The cab rolled on through the wet night, but Adrian felt the road beneath them change. This was no longer a ride home. It was the start of a burden he could not set down. The rain softened into a fine drizzle as the cab rolled past a line of dim streetlights, each one casting long reflections across the pavement. Adrian sat frozen in the back seat, his grip still tight on the worn leather, his mind racing through every word the driver had shared. A warehouse, a snapped cable, men dead, a report that vanished before it could be heard. He had tried to tell himself it could have been any company, any faceless corporation hidden in the sprawl of industry, but a detail the driver mentioned earlier would not leave his thoughts. The shipping schedules, the contracts, the location, they all aligned with a warehouse that sat firmly under the banner of his empire. Recognition hit him like a blow. This was not someone else's sin. This was his. The man behind the wheel had once worked inside the great machine Adrian had built. The men who had ignored his report, who had buried the evidence and branded him a liar, had done so under Adrian's name, protected by the shield of his success. For years, Adrian had told himself that his empire was clean, that the weight of logistics rested on efficiency and safety, that his managers cared as much as he did about the lives of the workers who moved the goods. But the story unfolding in this cab shattered that illusion. He leaned his head against the window, the cold glass seeping into his skin as he let the truth settle. His company was a giant, stretching across cities, employing thousands, but giants cast long shadows. And in those shadows, negligence had grown like mold, feeding on silence and buried reports. He thought of the managers who sat at his polished conference table, men who spoke in crisp numbers and smiled at quarterly results, men he trusted to oversee operations. How many of them had known? How many had signed their names across inspection logs they never read? The driver's voice cut softly through the storm of his thoughts. He said he never blamed the men on the floor. They were just trying to keep their jobs, to feed their families, to survive the grind. It was the ones above them who had turned truth into a curse, who had punished honesty because it threatened the flow of money. His tone carried no bitterness now, only a weary resignation. But that resignation burned hotter in Adrian's chest than any anger could have. He realized he had sat in meetings where glowing charts hid bodies, where silence was bought with promotions, where trust in the system had been misplaced. He thought of the families of the men who never came home, of a little girl recording her father's truth on a broken phone, and he felt the edges of his success cut sharp against him. The cab rolled on, the meter climbing, but Adrian no longer saw the city outside. He saw the shadow of his own empire, stretching long and dark, and in that shadow lay the truth he could no longer escape. The cab slowed for a red light, the glow of the signal spilling across the wet windshield, painting the inside of the car in shifting shades of red. Adrian sat forward slightly, waiting for the driver to speak again, knowing there was more that had not yet been said. The man gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, his jaw set as though he was wrestling with words that had been locked away for years. When he finally spoke, his voice shook, not from fear but from the weight of what he was confessing. He said he never hated Adrian. His tone made the words land with a surprising force, because hatred would have been easier. Hatred could burn and then fade. It could be aimed at one person and carried like a weapon. What he carried was heavier, harder to put down. He said what had broken him was not the accident itself, nor even the lies that had twisted his name, but the silence that followed. Silence that stretched over every attempt to be heard. Silence that grew thicker each time another door closed. Silence louder than any denial could ever be. Adrian felt the words cut through him. He thought of the years he had spent in glass towers, shielded from the noise of the world by assistants, by polished reports, by managers who only brought him what he wanted to see. He imagined the driver pounding on those doors, filing those reports, speaking into that silence until his voice cracked, and no one answering. He had believed silence meant stability, that no news was good news, but now he understood that silence could also be a weapon, a way to erase truth without ever speaking a lie. The driver's voice dropped lower as he continued. He said there were nights when he lay awake, wondering if he had been foolish to keep fighting, if maybe the silence meant he had been wrong all along. He said it was not just the company that ignored him, it was neighbors who stopped calling, friends who grew uncomfortable, even family who told him to let it go. He described how silence wrapped around him until it felt like the whole world had agreed he was invisible. Adrian's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, wanted to apologize, but the words stuck like stones in his chest. He had built an empire on precision and control, yet here was proof that in the cracks of that empire, silence had swallowed lives whole. He had always prided himself on truth, on data that never lied. But data could be buried, numbers could be twisted, and silence could be enforced. The cab moved again. As the light turned green, the city sliding past in streaks of light and shadow. Adrian pressed his palm against the seat beside him, grounding himself against the tremor that ran through him. The driver had not accused him, had not cursed his name, but the absence of hate felt even heavier. To be hated might have absolved him. To be ignored was worse. Adrian knew then that something had shifted. The silence that had protected his world could no longer be trusted. He could no longer hide behind it. The cab rolled to a gentle stop at the base of Adrian's tower, its glass walls rising into the night sky like a monument carved out of light. Rain clung to the surface, streaks of silver sliding down the windows, distorting the reflection of the city around it. Adrian sat in the back seat for a moment, staring up at the building that had come to symbolize his success. Tonight, it no longer looked like triumph. It looked like weight. A shadow as heavy as the driver's words still circling in his head. The meter glowed on the dash, its red digits steady at $10. A trivial amount to him, less than he spent on a cup of coffee at his favorite cafe, but it felt like the most expensive ride of his life. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a bill, his hand pausing as if money could balance what had been revealed in the space of a few miles. He wanted to believe that payment closed the ride, that it drew a line under the story he had been given, but his hand lingered on the bill as if refusing to let go. The driver did not look back. His eyes stayed on the windshield, watching the rain collect in rivers, his hands resting calm on the wheel. He did not ask for more, did not remind Adrian to take his receipt, did not even shift his shoulders. He simply waited, his silence holding more weight than any demand. Adrian studied him, the rough hands, the tired face, the quiet dignity that seemed untouched by years of betrayal. This was not a man asking for pity, not a man begging to be believed. He was simply a man who had told the truth once and had carried the punishment ever since. Adrian pressed the bill into the small tray between the seats, finally letting go, but his fingers brushed the edge as though he could take it back. He felt foolish. Money had always been the tool he used to solve problems, to smooth edges, to erase discomfort. But this time, money did nothing. $10 could not erase the memory of the accident, could not restore the driver's name, could not silence the echo of a child's voice recorded on a broken phone. He opened the door slowly, the sound of rain rushing in around him, cool air breaking the stale warmth of the cab. For a moment he stood with one foot on the wet pavement, one foot still inside, unwilling to choose between the world he knew and the truth he had been given. The driver glanced once into the mirror, their eyes meeting in the briefest flicker of connection, and then looked away. It was enough to remind Adrian that he could not leave this ride behind. The door shut softly, the cab pulling away into the night, its taillights vanishing into the rain. Adrian stood beneath his glass tower, the building shining like a beacon, but all he could feel was the emptiness left by the story that had followed him here. $10 lighter, but far heavier than when he had stepped in, he realized the true cost of the ride had only just begun. The penthouse was quiet when Adrian stepped inside, the kind of quiet he had always valued after long nights of meetings and calls. Yet tonight, the silence pressed against him like another weight he could not put down. He left his briefcase by the door, his coat still damp from the rain, and moved through rooms filled with polished glass and steel, everything perfectly ordered, perfectly designed, perfectly his. The lights of the city spilled through the floor to ceiling windows, a living mural of movement and color, but for the first time he felt no pride in the view. It only reminded him of the cab ride, of the man who had once worked in one of his warehouses, of the truth spoken in a voice that would not leave his mind. He poured himself a glass of water, but left it untouched on the counter. He tried to read the messages that had collected on his phone, questions from executives about schedules, projections, numbers that usually commanded all his attention, but the words blurred into nonsense. Every line of text seemed thin compared to the story he had just heard. He turned off the phone and walked into his bedroom, but even there the bed felt foreign, its smooth sheets and perfect symmetry offering no comfort. Lying down, he closed his eyes, but the images came too quickly. He saw a cable snapping, a weight crashing, men falling. He saw the driver sitting at a kitchen table with papers spread around him, writing a report that would vanish into silence. He saw a little girl holding a cracked phone, her voice steady as she defended her father. "My dad tells the truth." The words echoed as if they had been recorded into Adrian's own mind. He turned over, pressing his face into the pillow, but the sound remained. For years he had built his empire on precision, telling himself that efficiency meant safety, that order meant responsibility. He had trusted the reports laid before him, the polished charts, the tidy summaries. He had believed silence meant success. Tonight that belief cracked wide open. He knew now that silence could also mean buried truths, erased warnings, lives lost under paperwork. He thought of the managers he had trusted, men who spoke smoothly in boardrooms, and he wondered how many of them had known, how many had decided a man's honesty was worth less than a shipment delivered on time. He sat up in bed, restless, his heart heavy. For the first time in years, his conscience shook. He remembered the driver's voice, steady but tired, saying he never hated Adrian, only the silence that followed. That silence belonged to him too, woven into the empire he had built. He pressed his palms to his eyes, but no darkness could block the images now. The clock beside his bed ticked past midnight, then past 1, then 2. Adrian did not sleep. The cab ride had ended, but the driver's words looped endlessly in his mind. And with every loop he felt less like the master of a great machine, and more like a man staring at cracks he had chosen not to see. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that dulled the edges of the city and made the skyline look tired. Adrian had not slept. His eyes were raw, his body restless, his mind caught in the loop of the driver's story. By the time the sun pushed through the clouds, he was already at his desk, his laptop open, his phone buzzing with unanswered calls. For years he had trusted his managers to handle the details, to keep the machinery of his empire running clean, but now he no longer trusted silence. He began requesting files, digging through layers of reports that had not crossed his desk in years. What returned to him was a mess. Pages redacted with thick black lines, safety logs missing entire weeks, entries that ended abruptly as if someone had lost interest halfway through the truth. He scanned line after line, his pulse quickening with each blank space. One document listed an inspection scheduled for the very week the driver had spoken of, but the final signature was missing. Another file detailed equipment repairs, yet the receipts attached were from months earlier, for parts that did not match the machines in question. The further he looked, the more the holes multiplied, until the paperwork began to look less like order and more like a carefully built wall. Adrian leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He was not a man given to doubt, but there was no mistaking what he saw now. The driver had been telling the truth. His report had been real, and someone in Adrian's own company had buried it. Not only buried it, but replaced it with false entries, half-truths, and silence crafted to look like stability. He remembered the man's weary voice in the cab, saying he had lost everything to that silence, and he felt a surge of anger rise through his exhaustion. He pressed harder, demanding archived files, reaching into servers that most executives never bothered to touch. When he could not find answers in the neat folders, he dug into email records, flagged messages, digital scraps left behind by people who had once thought no one would look this deep. Slowly, patterns emerged. There were names of managers he recognized, Men who had smiled at him across long tables, their signatures appearing and disappearing across documents in ways that made no sense. There were conversations about costs, about deadlines, about keeping the numbers clean, but never about the men who had died. Adrian sat in the glow of his computer screen, the city alive beyond his windows, and for the first time he felt his empire tilt beneath him. The driver's story was no longer just a memory of a cab ride. It was proof, hard and undeniable, sitting in his own files. He thought of Lila's small voice on that broken phone, insisting her father told the truth. He whispered the words to himself, as if speaking them might steady him. My company buried him. The weight of it filled the room, heavier than any storm. Adrian had read through hundreds of pages. By the time the sun began to set again, his office floor littered with printouts, his screen filled with overlapping files and flagged emails. He had built a company on systems so tight that nothing slipped through unnoticed, yet here he was, staring at gaps wide enough to swallow lives. Somewhere in the mess of redacted lines and broken logs, the truth was buried, and he was not going to stop until he uncovered it. It happened almost by accident. A mislabeled archive folder opened onto a set of scanned documents, grainy and poorly indexed, almost as if someone had tried to hide them in plain sight. Adrian clicked through page after page until one caught his eye. The date matched the week of the accident the driver had described. His pulse quickened as he leaned closer. At the top of the page, under a header marked Incident Report, was a name he recognized now, not just as a stranger's, but as the man who had sat behind the wheel of the cab. The foreman's name was typed in bold, followed by a signature that matched the loops and curves he had glimpsed on other warehouse rosters. The report itself was detailed, painfully so. It described the frayed cable, the faulty crane, the repeated warnings submitted weeks before the collapse. It listed the time of the accident, the sequence of events, the immediate deaths of two men whose names were also recorded, men whose families had likely never seen these words. Adrian felt his stomach tighten as he read each line, the clarity leaving no room for denial. This was the report the driver had spoken of, the one that had vanished. It was real. And then he saw the stamps. Across the bottom corner, in thick black ink, the word void. Another page showed signatures from senior managers, their scrawled names layered with terse notes about financial exposure and unacceptable liability. Attached to the file was a payment ledger, small transfers routed through consulting fees, each one landing neatly in the accounts of men he had once trusted. Silence had not been an accident. It had been purchased, bought, like any other commodity his empire shipped across the world. Adrian pushed his chair back, the air in the office suddenly heavy. He thought of the driver walking out of the warehouse with that report in his hand, believing it would bring justice, only to have it erased by men who valued deadlines over lives. He thought of two workers who never came home, their families left with nothing but grief, while executives congratulated themselves on keeping contracts intact. He thought of Lila's small voice saying her father told the truth, a truth that had been buried under ink and money. The proof was in front of him now. He had the erased report, the foreman's name, the trail of payments that showed silence had been bought at the price of human lives. His empire had shadows he could no longer ignore, and in those shadows, men had been left dead in the dark. Adrian waited until the city lights had fully bloomed across the skyline before he made the calls. His office was dim, lit only by the glow of the monitor and the faint spill of traffic far below. The erased report sat in front of him, printed on paper that felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He had the names, the signatures, the payment trails that traced silence back to the very people who had sworn loyalty to him. He dialed the first number with steady fingers, his voice calm, when the executive answered, calm but lined with steel. They began with surprise, then with polite confusion, asking why he was calling so late, whether it could wait until morning. He cut through their words with the same precision he used to dismantle competitors. telling them plainly what he had found: the accident report, the voided pages, the money that had passed quietly between hands. He spoke without raising his voice, but the quiet firmness carried more force than shouting ever could. Excuses came quickly. One man said the report had been incomplete. Another claimed he had never seen it. Another blamed lower managers for the oversight. Adrian listened without interruption, his silence pressing harder than questions. When they faltered, he read lines from the report aloud: the names of the dead men, the specific warnings, the signatures scrawled across the margins. The sound of his own executives hearing their own handwriting recited back to them was like a hammer blow. Their words stumbled, their voices lost their polish, and the excuses collapsed under the weight of evidence they could no longer deny. One tried to say it had been necessary, that shutting down the warehouse would have cost millions, that contracts would have been broken, that jobs would have been lost. Adrian's hand clenched on the arm of his chair, but his voice stayed steady. He told them 2 lives had already been lost, and no number on a balance sheet outweighed that truth. Another attempted to shift blame further down, suggesting the foreman had been difficult, unreliable, a man who exaggerated. Adrian cut him short, his tone like ice, reminding them that he had seen the report with his own eyes, that the foreman had been right, that their decision to brand him a liar was nothing less than character assassination. By the end of the calls, the silence on the other end of the line was thick with fear. They knew they had been caught. They knew there would be no smooth explanations, no carefully drafted statements to bury this. Adrian told them to clear their schedules, that in the morning they would sit in front of him and answer for every page, every dollar, every death. He ended each call without waiting for a response, the disconnect tone final and sharp. When the last line went dead, Adrian sat back, his chest tight, his heart heavy but resolved. His empire had been built on precision, but it had also been built on trust, and that trust had been broken. Tonight he had confronted the men who betrayed it, and tomorrow the reckoning would begin. The night was wet again, rain falling in thin silver threads that streaked the glow of streetlights and turned the avenues into long rivers of reflection. Adrian walked past the waiting cars at the front of his tower, ignoring the black sedan his driver had already prepared, ignoring the umbrella held out to him by a concierge. He had given orders all day, confronted men who had once carried his trust, but now he wanted something different. He wanted to find the cab. He wanted to face the man who had carried truth quietly for years, while Adrian's own empire had been deaf. It took nearly an hour of walking the streets, his coat clinging to his shoulders, shoes darkened with water, before he saw it. The same cab, the same faded paint, dulled by rain, idling beneath a flickering street lamp at the edge of the avenue. The driver sat with both hands on the wheel, waiting for a fare, his eyes half hidden in shadow. Adrian approached slowly, feeling the strangeness of the moment. This time he did not raise his hand to hail the car, did not pull the door open and slide inside. He stopped by the driver's window, water running down his face, humbled by the knowledge he carried. The driver looked at him with recognition, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. He rolled the window down, the scent of rain and city air filling the space between them. Adrian stood outside, letting the storm soak his suit, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel like a man above another. He felt like a man who owed. "I found it," Adrian said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. "Your report, your name, the proof of everything they took from you." He paused, meeting the driver's gaze, seeing the years of silence etched into his face. "You were right. You were always right." The driver's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something that looked like disbelief slowly giving way to relief. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were testing whether Adrian's words could be trusted after so many years of lies. Adrian leaned closer, his hand resting against the wet frame of the cab, his voice firmer now. "They bought silence with money. They let 2 men die in the dark, and branded you a liar so no one would question them. I've seen it all. It ends now." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain drummed on the roof of the cab, steady and unbroken, as if marking time for them both. Then the driver nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than any speech. Adrian felt something ease in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. He did not climb into the back seat. He stayed outside, wet and unguarded, speaking through the open window like a man stripped of his armor. "I can't change what they did," he said, "but I will change what comes next. Your name will be restored. The truth will not stay buried." The driver studied him, then lifted one hand from the wheel, a gesture not of thanks but of acknowledgement. It was enough. Adrian turned back into the rain, lighter and heavier all at once, knowing the real cost of his empire had finally reached him on these rain-slick streets. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the city washed clean, but Adrian felt the weight of the night before pressing heavier than ever. Sleep had not come, and he knew it would not come easily again. The driver's story had unsettled more than his rest. It had torn through the careful distance he had built between his wealth and the lives of the men who carried the weight of it. He sat at the long table in his boardroom, the skyline spread behind him, the erased report laid out in front of the executives who had once hidden behind silence. Their eyes stayed low, their excuses already stripped away. And Adrian spoke with a clarity that surprised even him. He told them the cost would not be measured in fines quietly paid or in settlements buried in legal language. The cost would be real, visible, undeniable. Millions in restitution to the families of the men who had died. Millions more in programs to rebuild the warehouses into places where safety was not a promise but a practice. Every hidden corner would be lit, every broken machine replaced, every report carried to his desk, without delay. He said it not as a suggestion but as law, the new foundation of the empire they thought they understood. Some shifted in their chairs, calculating the damage to profits, the loss to shareholders, but Adrian silenced them with a look. He reminded them that money could always be earned again, that markets rose and fell with every quarter, but the weight of a name once destroyed could not be recovered. He had seen that weight in the driver's eyes, seen it etched across the lines of a man who had lost his livelihood because others decided truth was too costly. He would not let it happen again. Later, alone in his office, Adrian drafted the charter for a foundation that would bear the names of the two men who never came home from the warehouse. Their families would be cared for, their children educated, their memory held up not as a footnote in an accident log, but as proof that lives mattered more than schedules. He felt something loosen in his chest as he signed his name, not relief exactly, but the beginning of a balance long overdue. The numbers were staggering, the accountants would argue, but Adrian saw them differently now. He had spent years counting profits, chasing efficiency, praising silence when it kept operations smooth. Now he understood silence had been the most expensive cost of all. Breaking it, speaking truth, rebuilding trust, these were the investments that mattered. The driver's story had cost him sleep, and it would cost him millions more, but for the first time in his life, he felt certain the price was worth paying. As the city lights flickered on again, Adrian stood by the window, watching the streets where the cab might still be rolling, carrying other stories, other truths waiting to be heard. He whispered to himself that this was only the beginning. The real work, the real cost, had just begun. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.